Welcome to Grappling with the Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making to help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues, better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and I would like to welcome my guest for today. With me is Ann Neville, who is Vice President of Education for a trade association and enjoys connecting the right people to the right projects to promote successful collaboration and partnership. Mark O'Brien is founder and principal of O'Brien Communications Group, a B2B brand management and marketing communications firm, and host of The Anxious Voyage, a syndicated radio show about life's trials and triumphs. And Yolanta Pomiolto is Vice President of Information Technology for EXSIF. Do I say that out like EXIF or?
EXIF, yep. Yeah.
EXIF, okay. EXIF Worldwide, who manages innovative initiatives aimed at reducing operating costs, improving profit, and growing revenue. Thank you all for being with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. And here is the scenario we'll be discussing. When a hospital in Gaza exploded 2 weeks ago, headlines on CNN and the New York Times both parroted Palestinian claims that Israel was responsible. The BBC simply reported it as fact. All of them were wrong, but many still believe the accusation. This kind of information has been going on for a long time. In October 1996, the celebrated columnist Charles Krauthammer wrote in Time magazine, "As fighting raged in the streets of the West Bank and Gaza last month, Israel's opening of the now infamous Jerusalem tunnel was denounced from Turtle Bay to Timbuktu as a desecration of the Islamic holy sites in Jerusalem. It took nearly a week and fully 70 dead before the truth began to trickle out. The charge was a lie, an easily provable lie." Mr. Krauthammer continued, "If NPR had covered the blood libel-inspired massacre of the Jews in Munich in 1286, imagine what they might have written. Quote, leaders of the massacre claim that Jews had killed Christian boys and used their blood for religious rituals, unquote. For balance, I suppose, NPR would have added, the Jews deny this. On the one hand, we shouldn't expect or even want journalists to be overly clinical in their reporting, but when their personal biases clearly impair their objective reporting, they become tools of the wicked by lending legitimacy to villains and perpetrators and prolonging each crisis. Assuming that journalists truly believe they are serving the public interest, why are they so prone to error and one-sided reporting? Why does it seem to be getting worse? And what can we do about it?" I'll just add that I used to say that I watched Fox News and listened to NPR and tried to find some middle ground in between. I tend not to listen to either anymore because it's just the distance is so vast. It's hard to know where to get reliable information. So the floor is open. Who'd like to start us off?
I'll go.
Take it away.
So I just wanted to look up some definitions of journalism, and I found 2. One from Wikipedia says, journalism is the production and distribution of reports on the interaction of events, facts, ideas, and people that are the news of the day, and that inform society, here comes the phrase, to at least some degree of accuracy. I found another from a gentleman named Robert Niles that says, journalism is a form of writing that tells people about things that really happened, but that they might not have known about already. The most important characteristics shared by good journalists is curiosity. Good journalists love to read and want to find out as much as they can about the world around them. My sense is, for a number of reasons, those definitions are somewhere between idealistic and lost. Because I think what passes for news these days and I'll just stop here, I have more to say about it, is really, by and large, uninformed opining or compliance with popular narratives.
Absolutely. I have to show you, Mark. The first thing I have written here is what is it? What is a journalist?
There we go.
That was the first thing that came to my mind as well. Was, you know, what is a journalist, and does that vary from your age or your media access, or, you know, what I might have thought was a journalist, or where I might have gotten this information at one point has either changed, or, you know, as we know, and as Mark was just saying, you know, kids are actually, you know, going to social media and thinking that what they're reading is news and maybe coming from a journalist. So, yep, we're right on the same track. And I think too, related to what you were just saying about opining, I think, you know, the other thing I wrote on here was politics. And I think that's the, you know, that tends to go hand in hand these days too. And actually longer than I even realized, I think, when I saw a comment on one of your posts, Jonathan, when somebody said, I remember my parents choosing these forms. I'm like, gosh, I don't think that I realized it. I was obviously too young probably to realize it, but this has been going on longer than I think I realized.
Yeah. And I agree with that. Like, I was thinking, what is journalism? What is the intent? What is the goal? And ultimately, the way I see it is to provide an objective assessment of what's happening, the facts, right? Journalists are people, so they're going to have their lens, their personal lens on maybe their perspective, but ultimately we rely on quality journalistic sources for the truth, what's happening in the world. We're not there, we're not across the ocean, we're relying on these journalists to tell us what's happening on the ground, and to try to be as objective, to present both perspectives. I think that's the key. Is once you start seeing a news source like Fox News and all you see is one perspective, you know that that's not quality journalism, right? You want a full perspective, all angles discussed, all angles considered, all angles presented, and to be judgment free. You present the facts, you present all perspectives, and let the viewer decide, you know, kind of their emotional perspective on the situation, I think. So
yeah, there's one of the Mark, you might remember the name, one of the elder statesmen of NPR. Was it Daniel Eldridge? That sound right? He was reporting or commentating into his 80s. And I just remember him. He was talking about the Mideast, or maybe he was talking about politics in general. He said, well, the right doesn't like us and the left doesn't like us, so that's a pretty good indication that we're doing things right. And I cringed because there is something to that. But when Jabotinsky addressed the Peel Commission in 1937 about the pending partition of Israel, he told them that the British say exactly the same thing, that the Jews don't like us and the Arabs don't like us, so we must be being fair. It doesn't always work that way.
Yeah. And I think another point to make too is some of these journalistic, you know, outlets, they're funded, right? There's corporate dollars, like these are not non-for-profit organizations that are just reporting quality and facts. Like you look at publications such as the Washington Post, the New York Times, like there's big money involved. There's advertising revenue that's coming in. There's you know, there's influence on some of these journalistic outlets. So as part of that, we also have to be objective, like, you know, who's funding this paper, who's funding some of these ads, and are they trying to cater to a certain perspective, and just something to be aware of as we consume news that come to us. So,
you know, I think I need to follow up on that because I may have mentioned this in a previous episode, but you know who Barry Weiss is? She was the New York Times editorial writer, considered herself quite liberal, but apparently was on the least liberal end of the New York Times editorial staff, and she very publicly resigned, claiming that the culture had become toxic, that even somebody who was a mainstream liberal felt marginalized and under attack from the rest. And she started her own outlet through Substack. But I heard her say something that was fascinating and speaks to your point, Yolanta, that she said that when she publishes a post, and it's popular, and she goes to publish the next post, she finds herself self-censoring.
Hmm.
In other words, she feels compelled to give people what they want because that's how you keep them engaged.
Mm.
And she says, this goes against everything I believe, she says. And yet she can't uproot that inclination to pander to the audience.
Right.
Now, I give her a tremendous amount of
Right.
credit for having that self-awareness and being willing to talk about it. But doesn't that really speak to much of the source of the problem in trying to have an objective press?
Definitely.
This is probably going to be a bad paraphrase, but somewhere in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Zarathustra said, once one becomes a leader, one becomes a follower, because you've created this thing that you have to follow. And Yolanta, I found this fascinating. I had just written down the word responsibility when you said quality. And that made me wonder if we could equate quality to responsibility. But then you made the point about corporate and commercial interests. And so that, of course, invites the question, okay, what is the alleged journalist's responsibility? Is it to promote the agenda of the organization that's paying the journalist's salary? Or is it to be curious and to try to get as close as possible to something like objectivity? I'd never thought about it that way before. It's I'll call it philosophical, Jonas, and you'll call it ethical. But it's really quite the dilemma.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I was even thinking about it when Yolanta was talking about, being the boots on the ground and hearing the horrific stories of what, some of these reporters are going through and what they're experiencing. And to hear you say, are they doing this because they're being paid to do this? Are they doing, all of that, where is it coming from? I mean, obviously they're being paid to do it, but also they have clearly some desire to report what is actually happening, as Yolanta was saying earlier. Like, what is driving them? And I just thought of that as you were saying that. What is driving them then to put themselves in harm's way in order to, report what's happening or not?
I think part of that has to do with where they are putting themselves in harm's way.
Mm-hmm.
If they happened to be in Israel on October 7th, they were clearly in harm's way. If they happen to be in Palestine now, they're clearly in harm's way. I find myself thinking about ideology a lot. And it just seems that this is a test of a lot of people's ideologies. And I fairly frequently cite Kenneth Burke, who wrote something like an ideology is like a spirit that takes up its abode in a body, and it makes that body hop around in certain ways. And if a different ideology had happened to inhabit it, it would have hopped around in different ways. But that too, it seems to me, connects to responsibility, because Kenneth Burke wrote that at a time at which, I don't know, philosophical or journalistic responsibility was taken much more seriously. And I think he probably assumed that the people who received that message would be willing to examine their own ideological predilections. And I'm not sure that's true anymore.
There really has to be a continuous, civil, respectful, and thoughtful engagement between the sides. Republicans, I don't say that, conservatives and liberals need each other. This is going back at least 20 years that I think the statistic was 88% of people working in the New York Times were considered themselves liberals or Democrats. And it would be just as bad if that percentage were conservative, because when the culture becomes overwhelmingly tilted, as I forget, one of the old-time journalists said, I don't know anybody who voted for Richard Nixon. Well, of course not. But you have people who are liberal tend to be more idealistic, and therefore tend to go into fields like journalism and higher education. And therefore you get this groupthink that they're not even aware of. They simply don't have access to any other points of view. And if people who are more conservative are more inclined to go into business, then it seems like we're almost hardwired to get ourselves into this mess and hamstrung getting ourselves out.
Yeah, I think one thing we can agree on, Jonathan, is, the beauty of diversity and different viewpoints, right? Surrounding yourself with different perspectives, considering all options, and kind of really looking at things holistically versus just, this is the way I believe it, this is the way I see it. Having a broader perspective and being open-minded to a different perspective that you might hold internally. So just surrounding yourself with diverse viewpoints and at least being open to considering different perspective than your own. And I think good journalists do that, right? You've got this human bias to see things one way, but you also, it's your responsibility as a journalist to look at all angles, all perspectives, all sides, kind of to cover all the facts, and not to make bias and kind of decisions, right? You want them to give you what the reality on the ground is. And then also, so you've got the journalists, but you also have the editors, because ultimately it's the editor that puts together the publication, and they're ultimately looking at, how do I present this information? How do we, and I think the editors are not there on the ground, so they have a more independent perspective. So they should also put another layer of context. Are we reporting this? Is this truly factual? Are we jumping to conclusions here? So I think the editors play a critical role too.
Glad we're recording this. I think we should get the transcript of what you just said, Yolanta, and send that to newsrooms. I was a long time ago, I wrote a commentary for our local paper, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And even though, like most metropolitan papers, it was fairly liberal. And the editorial editor was also, but she had that attitude. We don't want one voice. We want different voices. We want to have a dialogue. And more recently, the paper came under fire for being slanted in its reporting. And they ran a full-page editorial, said, we've been accused of bias. And yes, we are biased. And that's a good thing.
Wow. What happened to their circulation after that?
Well, I think the circulation's been headed south for a long time, but I wrote in and actually got a response, but I said, no. I said, there's a difference between being biased and having an opinion.
Yeah.
And I got absolutely nowhere. I just got like a one line response to, no, they're the same thing.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I was thinking, Jonas, and after you mentioned the word tension, that if we don't recognize the necessity of tension, I wonder if we build traps for ourselves. And bear with me on this one. I'll connect the dots, I hope. But two people jumped into mind when I had that thought. One of them was Hunter S. Thompson, and the other guy was named now his name's gone right out of my head. It was Mike Adams, and he was a tenured professor of, I think, criminology at UNC. Now I forget which campus. That'll come back to me too. But he was an arch political flamethrower, to the point that became his identity. And I think both of those guys became so trapped in what became personas for them, because they were so resistant to the necessity of tension and balance. They both blew their brains out. so it just seems to me that if we can recognize, I'll put it a different way, that by recognizing the necessity of tension, it's the only way that we can find ourselves toward the middle, because we won't let ourselves become biased. And we will continue to be open and receptive and continue to want to talk with each other.
Or at least to recognize those biases. I don't think we can ever uproot our biases completely.
No, probably not.
You know, I don't claim to be objective when it comes to what's going on in the Mideast right now, but I do try to be intellectually honest. I mean, I wrote something in an article that I had understood was fact for years, and someone that I don't respect terribly much told me that I was wrong. And I went and looked it up and found that I had to modify my view on that issue. It would have been very easy for me to dismiss this person. And I've actually since heard others say the same talking point on national news shows. And it would be something I'd really be happy to believe, because it advances my cause. But there's no integrity in presenting non-facts to make your argument. If your argument's sound, you should be able to make it with the facts and with solid reasoning.
Yeah, I think all of it comes to what Mark started off, that definition of the ideal scenario is someone who gets into that profession, has that curiosity, understands what they're doing, understands that they're going to have an opinion and they're going to have bias, and they need to report what they, actually do the work and report what's actually happening. Because we all have, I mean, that's what I kept thinking about as I was, just kind of thinking about what we were going to talk about. And obviously we're talking about this particular situation, but journalists in general and across all different things. I mean, I was just thinking, automatically I go to sports. I'm a big sports fan. And that happens all the time. Of course, you have your team. You did not see the foul. There was no foul there whatsoever, and it's this, I feel like it's very similar. There's personalities, and I like to believe that I've always been a curious person. I've always been a person who looks for, like you were just saying, you watch the different, you look to the different media sources, you try to find the things. I had no interest in being a journalist. I have no interest in writing anything, but, too bad, because maybe I do have the right mindset to do that sort of thing. And, I guess it's that, this sounds so simplistic, but yeah, it's that combination of having the skills to do this and to have that, just to have that within you to be able to do that. Because I don't think, people aren't necessarily, maybe some, but aren't necessarily bad for, letting those things seep in and those things happen. It's just, just connecting those two skills or those two abilities. I know it sounds incredibly simplistic, but
no,
that's what's unfortunate.
No.
And you know what? What you're saying, Anne, actually causes me to connect a bunch of things that we've been talking about here. If you accept the idea that perception is reality, and that whatever we perceive to be reality is going to be, to some extent, the product of our biases, as Yonason pointed out, I think responsibility and integrity come in our ability to realize those things. I'm seeing this particular thing a particular way because of my own biases, and at the very least acknowledge those things. If not, try to present another point of view, which I know you're a huge fan of, Yonason, and being able to understand and articulate the other's point of view. I think that's probably a bit much to ask of journalists, but to at least recognize that this is the real world, and there's more than one explanation for every story.
And Unison, I think another thing to point out too is I work in technology, right? So with the advent of technology and social media, anybody can be a journalist. The internet is your oyster, right? You could set up a
Absolutely.
blog, you could set up an independent site that, you know, says it's objective. And I almost feel like there's a lot of not distrust, but who do you trust, right? You've got these established, credible news sources, because we know quality journalism requires resources. You got to put people on the ground, you got to interview, which costs money. It's not something that's like you could just do overnight and anybody could be a journalist. And I think it's the challenge, I think, with social media and with some of these online outlets. People are putting out all sorts of information and might not be credible, it might not be vetted, and it's out there and people consume it. A lot of individuals get their news from Twitter and TikTok and Facebook. And do you believe everything that you read? Is it coming from a credible source? If you have BBC making mistakes, like you've mentioned in your scenario, right? Reporting things, unfactual things, if a credible news source such as BBC is making such an assessment, like, God forbid what the uncredible news sources are reporting to, because they just piggyback, right? They just take that message and they just amplify it. And
Mhm.
then you've got the whole internet on fire believing something that's not true. So I just think that that's something to consider as well, is the democratization of media because of the internet and the outlets we have today where anybody can speak up, anybody could spread information and share information and start, you know, a variety of different news sources. So it's just I thought it was just working in technology. I always look at things like, how is social media helping the world to inform the world or misinform the world? Because it definitely is doing that.
Yeah, and you can really get into
Yeah.
some deeply unethical behavior here. And as I say, according to outlet X, such and such happened. Well,
Yep.
Yeah.
that's a fact.
Mhm.
It's a fact.
Right.
Mhm.
According to
Yeah.
that outlet,
Yeah, according.
it happened. I
Mhm.
haven't said anything that's not true, but I have given credence
Yeah.
to something that I may not have made any effort to verify. And now I'm helping that lie. What did Mark Twain say? A lie can make it around the world while the truth is still putting its shoes on.
Yep.
This stuff spreads so fast, and you
Yeah.
can't undo it. You know, and right after October 7th, you know, BBC, CNN, New York Times, NPR. These are outlets that Israel has never considered friendly. And they were virtually all outraged and horrified. I mean, Anderson Cooper was practically in tears over what he saw and describing how his battle-hardened cameraman got sick because he'd never seen anything like this. But it barely took a day before the drift in the other direction started saying, well, we're just going to end up back in our default of where we want to be. And you know, I have so much trouble understanding the unwillingness to self-regulate, to, you know, the sages say, don't trust yourself till the day you die. They're talking about virtue, but you can apply it to anything. Anytime I have a perspective, an outlet, and I don't try to find someone on the other side, you know, what you said before, articulating what others have said to them so they can tell us, do I have that right? So we can show them that we've made the effort to listen. It doesn't take that much. Maybe it's to your point, Yolanda, it's really just all about money.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, and I do think too, you know, because I was thinking that when I was thinking about what is a journalist, Yolanta, was all these things that come across different forms of media and people don't realize. So, you know, it also takes me back to kind of all of the comments. Is it about the journalist, or is it about the receiver and self-regulating, and you being the one to decide, like you started this off, Unison, again, about saying where you go. And I mean, I was thinking about it along the way too. And this is also how I thought about different people coming to different sources of media. And some of this sounds crazy, but I didn't like to read newspapers because I don't like the smell. I don't like the smell of the print, and I don't like it getting on my fingers. And so, I would do different things. And then you even talking about particular television or radio sources, and I don't like the sound of their voice, I don't like the sound of their voice. So I'm now going, I need media. I mean, I need digital media personally. And that's what I go to. And then I I poke around in different places. And then again, as we've all said too, and then these people that places I thought were credible resources for so long, I'm now like, oh, that's not any longer either. So it is about self-regulating and knowing, but there's too many people that aren't able to do that. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's on the journalist or it's on the human to figure out.
I think another aspect of social media is that it allows us to select the sources that already conform to or confirm our own biases.
Yep.
And it's actually kind of weird how that works. I think I don't even remember who the subject of the interview was, but I happened to see online somewhere that Sean Hannity was interviewing somebody. I absolutely consider myself to be a conservative, but when I saw that Sean Hannity was going to be conducting that interview, I couldn't watch it because I knew how completely predictable it was going to be. And, he's one of those people, I think, who has let his, I'll call them interests or predispositions, go so far that he's become a cartoon of himself. And, how does that happen? And how can you not recognize that it's happening to you? And I guess we're coming right back to your point, Yolanta. He's being paid too well to recognize that about himself.
Yeah, and on the same subject, I was a big fan of Bill O'Reilly when he was on the radio.
Yeah.
He was very opinionated and he was very gruff, but I always felt that he was fair. And when he went to primetime cable, he became a showman.
Oh yeah.
And I couldn't watch him anymore. Yeah, I mean, aside from his personal life, but I mean, it's that it has so much of that. We have to please the crowd. I don't know if it's as simple as that.
Someone
we're just lost, or is there?
Someone once said to me, actually, I think this was in my first corporate job. Actually, now I remember exactly who it was. It was this old timer named John Callahan. He said to me, Mark, never believe anything until it's officially denied. And when Bill O'Reilly introduced the no spin zone, it was over. I mean, come on, talk about telegraphing your punches. Done.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing I'll mention too is, newspapers and journalistic outlets, they have a target audience and they cater to different audiences depending on the paper too. So that's just something to be aware of, is like ultimately they need to sell the paper and they need to catch the latest story to be the first one to report so the paper sells. So I think there's also the dynamic of these competing news sources, who's the first one to break the story, who's going. So there's something to that as well that should be accounted for. But I'll give you another example too. I used to read the Wall Street Journal page to page a long time ago. Then it was acquired by Rupert Murdoch, and then I just saw the journalistic quality go down the hills, like never again, and I'm no longer a subscriber. So you choose what you consume. You choose, are you getting a balanced objective perspective, or are you start seeing more of opinion pieces versus factual pieces? So I think it's really
worrying. It's really worrisome considering that there's so much better than just about anybody else.
And I would say, going back even farther than that, I was an ardent subscriber to Rolling Stone magazine because I loved their
reporting,
music coverage. And then they got absurdly liberal and gave me the distinct impression that they had no idea who they wanted to be when they grew up. So I let it lapse. And as a side note, the older of my two sons, who's now 40, said to me when I did that, "What's the matter, Dad? Too modern for you?" Thanks, buddy.
It is always, that's always interesting, and that's kind of going down a different road, I guess. But I always find those comments like that, and because I hear it in my own house. And generally, I like to believe anyway, generally speaking, artists are lean a certain way. So you may have been the minority in their audience, in their minds. Like, you know, I always find that interesting because my husband will make those kinds of comments, and then I'm like, yeah, but did you not expect, you know, whoever to be liberal? Like, did you not expect that artist? Did you not expect that musician or that, you know, whoever to be? That's a whole other room, but it's related, I guess, because it is their magazine, and maybe that's what they're thinking their audience is.
Yeah, and I'm sure there were cultural changes that I just didn't allow for, couldn't keep up with, whatever.
Yeah.
I'm sure that thing in a way outgrew me.
Right.
I know
Right.
one of the outlooks that comes to my mind is, you know, if I'm a true believer, which already makes me dangerous, but if I'm a true believer, how can I just report the facts? How can I not take responsibility for framing an issue in a way that's going to help other people see it clearly? And
when you say you're a true believer and you say help people see it clearly, do you mean the way you do?
Well, of course.
But I would say, Jonas, and there are some situations where it's just clear right and wrong, right? So like, it's not like you're putting a bias on as a person, but you witness genocide, you see a group of people killing off another group. Like, there's just some things that are just clearly right and wrong, and I think it is of the responsibility to call it as it is, and to, you know, maybe as objectively as possible, right? Let people decide. But I don't think journalists have to be, there is no right answer, there's no right side. Like, I think there's many situations, especially in world politics and world events, where there's clearly a right and a wrong, and it's okay to choose the right side. Like, when Hitler started World War II, and you know, and he was trying to, you know, take over, set up concentration camps, killing, like, that's clearly wrong, and we should report factually about that, and we should make with the people who are reading that news, they should know the facts. There's these concentration camps, people are being sent to death, innocent people, you know, civilians. Like, that's just clearly wrong, and it's okay for a journalist to take a stand and say that here's what's happening, here are the facts, and, you know, it's not right, we need to do something about it.
Well, I agree with you in principle, but what we're seeing right before our eyes are journalists, or people, let's say people in journalism might be more accurate, are looking at the same events and interpreting them in completely opposite form. And it makes my blood boil, because when you start using terms like genocide and apartheid, and you don't know what they mean, because they are being widely used to mean something other than what they mean.
Fascism comes to mind too.
Yeah.
As does democracy.
Right.
Yeah.
I got into it with somebody online, and this person said, well, you haven't told me why it's not genocide. I said, well, I didn't think I needed to define the word, but I guess I do.
So oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I feel like, I mean, you did talk about, you know, previous experiences, and I think that I do find it interesting because obviously you have a very personal interest in this particular story that's not being always told in a factual way, but it's been happening for a really long time. So it's good to see your enthusiasm. Were you already getting this way previously about journalism, or with this story?
No, it's
in
been going on
particular?
for a long time. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember reading that quote from Charles Krauthammer when it
Right,
was published,
right.
which is really
Right.
surprising because I did not read Time magazine regularly. And so it's just providential that I happened to see that one when it came out, so I could use it in this in this
Yeah,
episode.
yeah.
But yeah, I do remember seeing it mentioned, if not by him, someone else, that the New York Times used to have their news, their editorials, and then something in the middle they would call news analysis.
Mm,
And I
mhm,
remember it being pointed out that had sort of disappeared. The news
mhm,
and the news analysis had gotten blended together,
mhm.
where opinion was now being presented in the context of fact,
Good point.
which seems to be the way things are going.
And
Yeah.
given the way we've evolved, you have to wonder if it would be possible for Charles Krauthammer to even get a job at Time magazine or to be published by Time magazine anymore. Probably not. And, you know, I'm not, you cited his name, Jonas, and so I'm going to do it again. I don't mean to single Anderson Cooper out, but what I don't understand is that people who were rightly horrified by what happened on October 7th would very likely have said then and there, Israel has an absolute right to defend itself. But overnight that morphed to retaliation. Well, wait a minute. If somebody's under attack, it's defense. It's not retaliation. And also, if you're trying to eliminate the threat, and at least in my version of journalism, that's not retaliation.
Yeah. I mean, we could go into lots of detail. We got to wrap this up, but we could go on for quite a while. You know, the one of the heads of the BBC was when they were criticized for not using the term terrorist. His explanation is, well, we don't use that term because that is an opinion term.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
2 days later, 2 days before, they reported on a terrorist attack in Sweden.
Yeah.
So they don't even listen to themselves.
Yeah.
I'll just leave you with one story to maybe lighten the mood at the end. When I was writing for the Post-Dispatch, and I told you I had a very good relationship with my editor. She was a lovely lady. But at one point, I joked with her. I said, I'm thinking of changing my name to Charles Krauthammer. And she said, oh, I hate him.
Oh,
And I said, really? Because they printed him.
yeah.
He was a regular his column was regular in the paper. She said, yeah. He makes so much sense. I find myself agreeing with him and I don't.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I was too protective of my position at the time to say anything, but I now regret I didn't say, well, you know.
That happens.
That is an amazing statement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a lot to do, I think, with where we are. So there's a lot more we could talk about here, but thank you.
I'm sorry, I just got to add this.
Go ahead.
It reminds me of Woody Allen saying, I don't mind dying. I just don't want to be there when it happens.
Yeah, somebody else said, they said, you'll be late for your own funeral. I said, I certainly hope so.
Amen to that.
Well, thanks so much. This has been a really valuable, thoughtful conversation, as it usually is.
Thanks to you.
Mark
Thank
O'Brien,
you.
Yolanta Palmiotto. I'm going to get comfortable with your name these days. Thank you all. For those of you who are watching or listening, if you have a topic you'd like us to take up, please go to my website, ethicsninja.com. Use the contact information. If it's compelling, we'll certainly use it for a future episode. And until then, as always, I encourage you to continue grappling with the gray.